Welcome back. The strangest urban legends don't begin in graveyards or abandoned hospitals. They begin in places so ordinary your brain doesn't bother putting up its guard. A family living room, a bowl of cereal going soft in milk, the hum of an old television warming up in the corner. That is what makes this one so effective and honestly so much worse. Because before Candle Cove became one of the internet's most infamous modern myths, it arrived wearing the safest disguise possible, a children's show people thought they remembered from childhood. On the surface, everything about that memory sounds familiar enough to be harmless. A cheap puppet program from the 1970s. Maritime sets made of painted cardboard, salt-stained ropes, fake waves, a lonely little girl imagining adventures at sea. Not all at once, that is the trick. First, it is just the puppets. One of them, Pirate Percy, isn't charming like old characters should be. He is twitchy. The painted eyes don't look lively, they look fixed. Another character doesn't seem mischievous or theatrical so much as wrong. Like somebody built a villain after misunderstanding what children are afraid of. And then there's the figure people would later describe in the most unsettling terms. The one they called the skin taker. That is where the everyday setting starts to feel poisoned. Because nothing in the story happens under moonlight or in some obviously cursed place. It happens in broad, domestic routine. A child sits too close to the TV, static hisses between channels. Years later, online, strangers began talking about the show with the same eerie confidence. Confidence people usually reserve for schoolyards, old commercials, and forgotten songs. They didn't describe it like a creepypasta, they described it like memory. That low-budget pirate theme, those malformed puppets. That feeling the show didn't want to entertain children, but hold them still. And that is the bad detail lodged inside the ordinary frame. Not just that it was creepy, but multiple people remembered it the same way. Same characters, same mood, same ugly, grainy, half-lit world. And absolutely no tape to prove it. What made the Bunnyman story survive wasn't just the image, it was the setting. Suburbs are supposed to feel organized, buffered, safe by design. Split-level homes, trimmed lawns, familiar roads with harmless names. But Fairfax County had one pocket where that safety seemed to thin out after dark. The road narrowed, and the shadows grew longer. By the time locals started calling it Bunnyman Bridge, the bridge had already become more than concrete and steel, a stage for dread. Not because anyone had proven some supernatural force lived there, but because the structure itself did half the work. The underpass is low, claustrophobic, stained by age. Headlights hit the walls and bounce back in a dirty wash. The railroad tracks above turn every passing train into a sudden assault of metal. If you stand beneath it at night, you don't just hear the train. And that matters, because the legend didn't spread in bright daylight. It spread in parked cars, on back roads. In the hour when teenagers cut engines and let the silence settle in. In that silence, every small thing becomes loaded. A branch dragging over a roof sounds deliberate. Gravel popping under a tire sounds like a footstep. Something pale between the trees doesn't read as fabric, it reads as a body. The details people kept repeating only made it worse. Not a ghost, a man in a filthy rabbit suit, white gone gray, as if the costume had been stored somewhere wet and forgotten. The kind of outfit that should belong to a shopping mall Easter photo, or a cheap birthday party dragged into the woods and ruined. That is what gives it its particular sickness. A bunny costume is meant to signal innocence, children, candy. Then there were the stories hanging around the legend like a rotten smell. Animals found mutilated, shapes dangling from branches. Whispers of missing people folded into local talk. Until nobody could say where fact ended and embellishment began. That uncertainty didn't weaken the fear, it thickened it. Because now the road to the bridge wasn't just a road. So when that first documented night in October 1970 arrived, the setting was already perfect for panic before anyone understood what was happening. A quiet car, a couple alone after a football game. Windows fogged slightly from their breath, the ordinary softness of conversation. Then, in one instant, the world outside the glass stopped being distant. It came through the window violently. At first, people treated it like a simple crime blotter story. A man in a white outfit steps out of the dark, shouts that someone is on private property, claims he has their license plate, and then sends a hatchet crashing through a car window. That sounds ugly, but still explainable. A vandal, a trespass dispute, one unstable stranger with a weapon and a costume. Start with what was left behind. Not a rumor, not a footprint, not a second-hand description passed around a diner. An actual hatchet on the floorboard of the couple's car after they fled. That matters because it changes the shape of the story. If this had only been fear in the dark, people could have argued they exaggerated. Panic does that. Night does that. But a tool with weight, with a handle, with a blade is harder to explain. It says whoever confronted them was close enough to strike the glass, strong enough to shatter it, and reckless enough to lose the weapon. Suddenly, this isn't just about a spooky silhouette in a costume. It is about contact, distance collapsed, someone was there. Then, 10 days later, the second layer peels back. October 29th, different witness, different location. Not a parked car this time, but an unfinished home, quiet and skeletal. Watched over by construction security guard Paul Phillips. He sees a man in a rabbit suit attacking a porch post with an axe. Not hiding, not retreating, just swinging. The costume is described in pieces, gray, black, and white, which makes it feel less like a clean mascot suit and more like something assembled, mismatched, improvised. That detail matters too because it pushes against the first assumption. If the first incident suggested a property owner trying to scare trespassers away, the second looks stranger. Why hack at a porch post on a vacant site? Why perform destruction where no one needed to be driven off? It feels less defensive now, more compulsive, less warning, more ritual. And then there is the voice. Paul hears the same territorial language. You're trespassing. But this time the threat escalates with horrifying clarity. Come any closer, and I'll chop off your head. That isn't just anger, it is specificity. The first encounter could be read as intimidation. The second turns intimidation into fantasy. The rabbit suit stops looking like a random disguise and starts functioning like a mask that permits violence or the performance of it. Same theme, sharper edge, which means the pattern isn't weakening under scrutiny. It is tightening. That is where the town made its first mistake. Once the headline hit, people stopped treating the two sightings as connected evidence and started treating them as open territory for invention. A man in a bunny suit became the bunny man. A suspect became a figure. And because police never produced a clear identity, every gap in the file got filled by local imagination. Escaped mental patient, murderer beneath the bridge, bodies hanging in the dark. None of it verified, all of it sticky. And here is the problem when a case remains unresolved. Folklore doesn't grow around the facts, it grows inside the empty spaces between them. Look closely, and you can see the transformation happen in real time. The original reports are grounded in very plain things. A road, a car window, a license plate, a porch post, an axe handle in someone's hands. Then the later story leaves those objects behind and drifts toward the bridge. The midnight dares, the hanging victims no one can name. The more dramatic the retelling becomes, the easier it is to miss what is actually unsettling. Not that a supernatural killer haunted the town, but that two separate people in a very specific stretch of October described a man in a rabbit outfit using edged tools and threatening decapitation over trespassing. That is already enough. The legend didn't need ghosts, it only needed repetition. And repetition did the rest. By the 1980s, the factual spine of the case had been wrapped in fear. Until kids weren't visiting because they believed evidence, they were visiting because they inherited atmosphere. The overpass became less a location than a stage. Midnight mattered because everyone said it did. Cameras showed up because television had already blessed the place as haunted territory. Skeptics looked at the same story and saw a lone vandal inflated by gossip. They may not be wrong, but even that reading leaves one stubborn question behind. Why did this particular vandal endure when thousands of local crimes are forgotten? Almost immediately. Because the clues were crude, physical, and unforgettable. A rabbit suit where no rabbit should be, a hatchet inside the victim's car. An unfinished home turned into a backdrop for a man chopping wood in the dark. And talking about severed heads. Each detail is too concrete to vanish, yet too incomplete to resolve. And the final clue isn't hidden in the old reports at all. It is in what the town does now. Every Halloween, police block off the Colchester overpass. Not because they expect an apparition with floppy ears and an axe, but because too many real people are willing to test the story with their bodies. That decision is a kind of evidence. It tells you the legend crossed a line. The danger moved from the original suspect to everyone who came after. The imitators, the thrill seekers, the kids who mistake inherited fear for invitation. Here's where the story stops being about a creepy image and becomes far more believable, which is exactly why it lingers. Legends don't survive for decades just because they look strange. They survive because they give people a usable explanation for what they're already afraid of. In Greenock, the figure in the dirt wasn't just a monster in the dark. He was a container. People poured their anxieties into him until he became whatever they needed him to be. To some, he was proof that something inhuman had slipped into the town. To others, he looked like the end result of neglects so complete it erased him, and left behind only behavior, hunger, and instinct. That difference matters because it tells you less about what he was and more about what the town could bear to admit. Think about the theories people kept repeating. A feral hybrid, a psychiatric patient forgotten by the system, an abandoned sailor who drifted into a port town and out of society itself. Those aren't random guesses. Each one comes from a recognizable wound. Fear of the outsider, fear of mental collapse. Fear that a man can fall far enough through the cracks, that he stops reading as human to the people walking past him. The body people described, filthy skin, low crawl, glowing eyes in bad light. Teeth working at scraps of food became evidence for every story at once. And once a community starts assigning meaning to a figure like that, the figure stops being a person in the public imagination. He becomes a warning label. That is why pity and horror sat side by side. Some residents left food out the way you would for a stray cat, which sounds compassionate until you look closer. Feeding him from a distance also preserved the myth. It allowed people to acknowledge his existence without inviting the harder questions. Who was he before this? Why was he living among abandoned buildings? Who failed him when he was still reachable, still nameable? Still someone with a door key, a medical file, a last known address. A sandwich left near a ruin is easier than a phone call to social services. Easier than eye contact, easier than responsibility. In that sense, the legend may have functioned like a sedative. If he was a creature, no one had to reckon with the possibility that he was a man the town had watched disappear in slow motion, and that rumor that he never aged only deepened the need. People swear he looked the same from one decade to the next, because myth prefers stillness. Real human decline is messy. It changes the face, weakens the body, adds details that force recognition. A legend freezes its subject at the most memorable moment. The same crouched posture, the same grime dark skin, the same animal glare caught in headlights or on a shaky phone camera. Once that image locks in, every future sighting gets compared to it. Corrected toward it, sharpened by memory, the mind does the rest. Not because witnesses are lying, but because fear is a brutal editor. It cuts out the ordinary and leaves only the features that support the story. And maybe that is the ugliest motive buried inside all this. Not his, but everyone else's. Communities sometimes need a border figure, someone who lives just outside the rules, so everyone else can feel a little safer inside them. The Catman became that border. Parents used him to warn children. Teenagers chased him for thrills. Cameras hunted him because a glimpse of him could turn a local rumor into proof, and proof into attention. Every retelling fed the same appetite, not simply for fear, but for distance. If the thing under the cars is a beast, then we are not. If the eyes in the dark belong to a legend, then poverty, isolation, mental illness, and abandonment can stay conveniently disguised as folklore. That is what makes the story so hard to shake. The motive doesn't have to be supernatural to be devastating. Sometimes the reason a figure becomes immortal in a town's memory is that too many people benefited from not seeing him clearly. They could call him cryptid, drifter, phantom, anything but neighbor. And once a person is reduced to a shape in the shadows, the town gets to keep its mystery and lose its guilt in the same breath, which is also why the next legend feels so modern. The monster is no longer under parked cars or inside abandoned buildings. It appears in the most intimate place possible, your screen, your room, your own hand still resting on the mouse when the message refuses to close. And that is where this stops feeling like a supernatural chain message and starts looking like a mirror. The most disturbing part of the Red Room legend was never the blood-soaked screen or the idea of some curse crawling through your monitor. It was the moment people realized a real child had looked at that imagery, clicked through it, sat with it, and then carried something from that screen back into the physical world. Not a demon, not a virus, a permission structure, a script for violence dressed up as taboo entertainment. By the time that case hit the news, the public wanted an easy answer. They wanted to believe one horrifying animation had flipped a switch and created a killer. That explanation is neat. It is also dangerously comforting. Because if the screen did it, then nobody has to look any deeper. Nobody has to ask what was already there before the bookmark. What fascination had already taken root, what fantasies were already rehearsing themselves in private, long before investigators opened that browser history. The Red Room did not need to create darkness. It only had to give it a stage set, a color palette, and dialogue. That is the black truth, buried inside almost every version of this story. The pop-up is only memorable because it mimics a much older human mechanism. Repetition, escalation, surrender, first the question appears. Then it refuses to go away. Then the room seems to close in. Then the viewer feels watched. It is basically a digital reenactment of obsession itself. Click, deny, return, look again. And once that pattern gets attached to violence, the image doesn't remain on the screen. It starts nesting in the mind, in a dark bedroom lit only by a monitor with message boards open, username scrolling, and that cheap flash window blinking red against someone's face. The legend offers more than a scare, it offers participation. It tells the lonely, the angry, the curious, and the already unstable that they aren't just watching horror, they're standing one step away from entering it. That is also why the story mutated so easily into rumors about hidden live streams and pay-per-view torture rooms. Not because there was solid proof, but because the internet taught people a terrible lesson. Somewhere, someone is always willing to watch. The Red Room myth survived because it attached itself to a real market in appetite, voyeurism, detachment, the thrill of seeing what should never be seen. The technology changed, the websites changed, the file formats changed. But the mechanism underneath stayed embarrassingly human. Curiosity with the brakes cut, distance mistaken for innocence. A person alone at a keyboard telling themselves that looking isn't the same as doing. But that separation is exactly what the legend quietly destroys. It says the screen is not a barrier, it is a door. And whether or not any cursed file ever killed anyone is almost beside the point. The fear endures because people know on some level that images do things. Repetition does things. Immersion does things. Spend enough time feeding on cruelty, and cruelty stops looking impossible. It starts looking legible, then familiar, then usable. That is what made the Red Room so effective as modern folklore. It wrapped an old moral panic in new technology, then brushed against a real-world crime that made the warning feel less like fiction and more like actual evidence. So when people remember that legend, they remember the red screen, they remember the names, the promise that the walls will be painted by morning. But the detail that should stick is quieter than that. A saved bookmark, a history log. A child's computer examined under fluorescent light while adults try to measure intent. No ghost ever had to step out of the monitor. The darker possibility was always that no ghost was necessary. And once you accept that, once you understand that the monster in stories like this may simply be human attention pushed past its moral limit, the next legend feels less like fantasy and more like a dare someone will answer. Which is exactly why the next case doesn't begin with a creature at all. It begins with a place, a bad decision, and a story people kept telling, until the story itself started leading people toward the tracks. And this is the part that should follow you after the screen goes dark. Because the most unsettling thing here was never a horned creature on a bridge. It was how easily a rumor can borrow the weight of a real place, a real structure, a real train schedule, and turn curiosity into a body count. The trestle didn't need claws, it didn't need glowing eyes. It only needed teenagers, a dare, a stretch of darkness, and the stubborn human belief that bad things happen to other people. That is what gives these stories their aftershock. Long after the legend is retold, what remains are the details. No myth can soften. Splintered wooden ties, slick with night air, steel rails trembling under your palms. The sound of a train arriving before you can see it. The sudden understanding that there is nowhere to run. A local warning becomes a challenge becomes a ritual. Then somebody slips, somebody freezes, somebody holds on for 1 second, less than they needed. And by morning, the story grows another layer. Not because the monster appeared, but because fear gave the accident a face. Here is what makes that truly disturbing in the real world. This pattern isn't unique to one bridge, one town, or one old piece of folklore. Give people a cursed road, a haunted tunnel, an abandoned hospital. And someone goes there not in spite of the danger, but because of it. They bring flashlights, phones, friends, nervous laughter. They record the walk up, they joke until the atmosphere changes. Then the place starts doing what places do. Concrete crumbles, water rises, trains keep time, gravity never misses. And afterward, the legend gets credit for damage caused by something far more reliable and far more merciless, ordinary reality. That is why these stories survive. They don't need proof, they need repetition. They need one person saying, "My cousin knew someone who went there." They need one newspaper clipping, one memorial, one bouquet zip tied to a fence. One emergency call in the middle of the night. After enough retellings, the warning and the temptation become the same sentence. Don't go there. People say something waits there. For a certain kind of mind, especially young, restless, half afraid, and half thrilled. That doesn't sound like a deterrent. It sounds like an invitation. And maybe that is the darkest takeaway of all. Human beings are meaning-making machines. We hate random tragedy. We hate the idea that a person can die because they misjudged distance, panicked under pressure, or arrived 1 minute too late to get back off the tracks. So we build a shape around it. We invent intent. We say the place wanted them. We say something called them there, because that feels cleaner than admitting the truth. Sometimes people walk willingly into deadly situations because the story around the danger makes them feel chosen, brave, or untouchable. So if this legend lingers, let it linger in the right way. Not as proof that some creature still stalks the dark, but as proof that folklore can become infrastructure, pressure, and momentum. It can sit in the back of a car full of friends. It can ride in a late-night joke. It can live in the sentence, "Come on, let's just see it for ourselves." And once that sentence is spoken, the monster has already done its job. Because in the end, the thing waiting out there is rarely supernatural. It is a set of tracks that won't bend for anyone. It is the false confidence of being young. It is the silence right before panic. When a legend points toward a real-world edge and asks you to get closer, listen carefully to what is actually calling. It may not be a monster. It may be the oldest trap in human history, the urge to touch the forbidden thing just to prove you can walk away. Some people do, some don't.